Okay, very good. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Education and Neighborhoods Committee for June 23rd. What is that horrible noise?
A whine.
I don't even know anything.
It's a vuvuzela.
Can we find out what that is? That's going to be tremendously distracting. Well, in any event, whatever that noise is, we're ready to begin with this meeting. I'm joined here by the Honorable Councilmember Dennis Devine, and we are ready to begin. There's only one item on the agenda today, and oh, there. Thank goodness. That sound is gone. So why don't we'll be taking general public comment following the presentation on item one. And so if we could begin with item number one.
Mr. Chairman, item number one, it's a presentation by the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment relative to the Neighborhood Council Funding Program.
All right. And on that matter, I'd like to invite Mr. Kim to come up and offer his comments. Mr. Kim, welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Councilman Zine. Bungwen Kim, still the General Manager, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. You requested for a overview of the Neighborhood Council Funding Program. There's a lot to go over, and I'm going to try to stay on the higher level ground as much as possible. But if I get too caught in the trees, why don't you just remind me to get back up on a level that you can understand. So
we like the trees.
You like the trees?
The trees are good.
Good. It's hard to talk about the funding program without getting into the trees somewhat, so I'll be doing that. So our main department functions for the Neighborhood Council Funding Program as it was originally conceived. We serve as a bank for 89 neighborhood councils. We issue city checks. We also manage purchase cards. We also used to manage petty cash accounts for 89 neighborhood councils. We're also an auditor for the neighborhood councils. We also fulfill a training and education function for neighborhood councils. Roughly 30% of neighborhood council treasurers turn over every year. We have a rough guesstimate that about 50% of neighborhood councils lack adequate fiscal controls. We're going to look a little more deeply into this because we're looking at some key metrics of what financial health will look like for neighborhood councils, but it's clear that all neighborhood councils are required to maintain their own financial records. The city has not been consistent in making sure that neighborhood councils do that on a regular basis. We're also a policy enforcer. So when there are policies in place, many city guidelines about appropriate and legal use of public funds, we're also expected to play that role. And then lastly, we implement new city policies and procedures. For example, about 6 months ago, the City Council passed a grants and donations ordinance, which allows neighborhood councils to provide grants to nonprofit organizations and public schools. Part of the ordinance also allowed neighborhood councils and the city department to receive donations of funds. And we also are expected to implement the results of audits, say from the city controller when they come in and review the funding program. As part of this, these last 6 months of what transpired in terms of the mayor's proposal to the city council to consolidate the city department under CDD and to reduce our staffing, we had to establish some short-term goals for the funding program. Firstly was to obviously implement efficiencies. So as much standardization as possible. We also need to work with our city fiscal partners, with the mayor and city council, the neighborhood councils, the controller, the treasurer, office of finance. These are all entities that we have to coordinate with to make sure that we're implementing the funding program according to city policies. And we're also enforcing city policies. So when we issue directives from the department to make sure that neighborhood councils are following procedures, we will, if we find that after due notice they are not following procedures, we will suspend funding privileges until they've been remedied. Our staffing as a result of the city's reduction of the city's workforce, our funding program went from 8 full-time staff to currently 4 full-time staff. So you can imagine the tremendous pressure that our staff are under, and it's all that I can do to keep convincing them from transferring to other city departments that, one, don't have furloughs and have easier workload issues. So these are some of the unintended consequences of what the city has, what city leaders have had to do in terms of responding to the fiscal crisis. We've also assigned our field staff to help with the funding program as well, in terms of some of the front-end reviews of funding requests. I'd like to go over some of the efficiencies and policies.
Can you talk
Yes.
about that just a little bit more? What does that mean? What exactly have field staff been assigned to do with regard to the?
So up until recently, for example, all of the funding program responsibilities were solely the responsibility of funding staff. So in this case, what we've done is take the field staff and actually assign them to review all of the demand warrants, because one of the issues that we have in terms of workload issues is that many neighborhood councils don't submit the proper documentation that the controller requires to make sure that we could approve all of the payments. So there's a lot of back and forth between our department and the neighborhood councils. You know, we're missing this document, can you send this? The treasurer is on vacation, et cetera. So we have literally hundreds of demand warrants that go back and forth in that mode. So we've assigned the field staff to help clarify and make sure that all the paperwork is submitted so that we can then transfer it to the funding staff, and the funding staff is solely responsible for processing checks, not making sure that the package is complete.
So does that mean then that the payment requests need to go through 2 levels of done staffing? They go to the field staff to ensure that the paperwork is in place, and then that completed package then goes off to the funding staff?
Correct. But for the most part, for neighborhood councils, it's transparent to them. I mean, it's not evident to them. All we're doing is making sure that we're trying to turn around the demand warrants in a much more expeditious manner.
And although it goes through 2 hoops, it in some respects could expedite things, because the first stop is ensuring that the paperwork is in place so that you don't have that back and forth with the downtown staff.
Correct. In fact, the whole purpose is to make sure that it's run more efficiently.
Okay.
Yes. It's not adding another layer of bureaucracy. It's actually adding more manpower to the processing.
Okay. Thank you.
Person power. Some of the efficiencies and policies that we've implemented over the last 6 months. We suspended demand warrants as of April 15th because we knew that in order to meet all of our year-end closing responsibilities, we would not be able to continue processing demand warrants and meet all our other responsibilities. We expect to lift that suspension as of the new fiscal year July 1st. As I mentioned before, we've streamlined the processing responsibilities for all remaining staff. So we have 19. We went from 36 full-time positions to currently 19. This is an all-hands-on-deck project in terms of making sure that the funding program is staying afloat. We have a checklist.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kim. Can we go back one step, please? Because I just want to make sure I understand what the facts on the ground are here. If the demand warrant process was suspended in April, there are certain requests out there for payments to be made for demand warrants to be issued in April. If that process is suspended, then does that have the practical implication of increasing the amount of rollover that those neighborhood councils will have, because they're then in the last 2 months of the fiscal year? If those demand warrants aren't paid, then those expenditures that would have been made in April and May and June will now have to be paid in the subsequent fiscal year.
Yes, that would be one of the effects.
Okay.
To help offset the suspension of demand warrants, we've increased the purchase card limit from 1,000 to 2,500. So we thought that would facilitate the spending of funds.
Okay.
Yes, to counterbalance it. But, either way, we wouldn't have been able to process those demand warrants. So whether we suspended them or whether we continued to accept them, we wouldn't be able to process them in enough time to avoid the issue that you're talking about.
Right. Okay.
So we are returning all demand warrants that don't have complete documentation. This is one of the business processes that we've improved. Where we got caught up in some confusion is when we would accept demand warrant requests lacking all the documentation that's required, and we end up going into a back and forth with neighborhood councils, and that requires a lot of staff time. So in order to avoid that back and forth, we're saying if the front page cover list is not, all the boxes are not checked, we're just returning it to you, and then it's your responsibility to submit a fully completed demand warrant to our department, after which we'll respond. We're also calling vendors because we also have an issue of vendors not being paid on time. That's connected to the processing of the demand warrants and neighborhood councils submitting incomplete demand warrants. And so we have to sometimes on our own call the vendors directly. Now we are currently backlogged about 350 demand warrants, and that goes back as long as 2 years ago. And again, this goes back to lack of documentation.
And how has that backlog changed over time, over the last 2 years or so?
I don't have really good data because we haven't been tracking that, but it's correlated to the reduction in our funding staff over the past 6 months.
Okay. It would be safe to assume that the backlog now is greater than it was a year or two ago?
Yes.
And so the delay in payments is increasing, I assume, as well?
Correct.
Okay.
Rollover funds and the payment of processing. As you recall, the City Council had taken action to allow limited access to rollover funds for neighborhood councils, and based on council action, we have processed those. A number of those are being paid. But a number of those will also be added to the rollover amount for the next fiscal year. And collaborating with the city controller, we're working with them to try to streamline as much of the paperwork requirements as possible, because the city is really set up to deal with other city departments. It's really not set up to deal with neighborhood councils or volunteer-driven system who have volunteer treasurers. And so we're trying as much as possible to design a system that is as streamlined and user-friendly as possible. There's a lot of documentation requirements that can get quite onerous for the average citizen out there trying to get payments through the city.
And so this move in the direction of standardization doesn't suggest any standardization of priorities among neighborhood councils or what they spend their money on or anything like that. It's simply a matter of making the process aspect of it, the forms, standardized among the councils so that it's easier for the department to serve the needs of the neighborhood councils, expedite payment, ensure transparency and accountability.
That's correct. It's really designed to increase the banking function that our department plays for neighborhood councils.
Okay.
Petty cash. As you know, we discontinued petty cash some months ago. We had a May 18th deadline for every neighborhood council to submit their reconciliation worksheets and to submit their remaining cash. We literally received pennies from some neighborhood councils as a part of the closeout. As of today, 13 neighborhood councils have not complied with the deadline, and their funds have been frozen. We are not able to audit these petty cash accounts due to staffing shortages. So the reconciliation worksheet that some neighborhood council have been provided by the department is the basis for which we are using to close their petty cash account. The bank card. Some of the program modifications that we've made. As I mentioned earlier, we increased the maximum allowable charge to $2,500. I intend to extend that into the next fiscal year because we're going to continue to have the same staffing shortages into the next fiscal year. we've required that all expenditures be reviewed by every neighborhood council in a public meeting every month. Because we feel that with the increased exposure that the purchase card represents to the city, we need to make sure that neighborhood councils are looking over their funds on a regular basis. As you may recall, some of the embezzled funds in the past was largely due to neighborhood councils not reviewing their financials on a regular basis. So we issued that directive along with the increase in the purchase card limit. Whatever staff we have available, we'll conduct random compliance audits. So we'll be doing spot checks to see how many neighborhood councils are actually reviewing their financials on a regular basis. We also have online accessibility of all financial transactions. We have it on our website for both the checks and the purchase card. They're uploaded every other week, twice a month, on the 15th and 30th of every month, so it's relatively fresh data. So we're really counting on stakeholders and neighborhood council board members to keep an eye on on these public funds as one safeguard. As they say, transparency is the best disinfectant, so that's the approach that we're taking. U.S. Bank also has a very sophisticated transaction and financial data for all the purchase cards. All the neighborhood council treasurers are expected to register their accounts with U.S. Bank. And just like we have our accounts with credit card companies and banks where we can look at all of our financial transactions on a real-time basis, that's pretty much what U.S. Bank provides for neighborhood councils. Financial statements. As I mentioned before, we're requiring all neighborhood councils to review their purchase card transactions and submit them for board approval. There is a longstanding policy of neighborhood council responsibility for financial management. And as I mentioned before, we'll conduct spot audits. Year-end closing. As we approach the end of the fiscal year, there are a number of projects and tasks that the department is responsible for, one of which is an end-of-year reconciliation. As I've presented to the committee and full council on some of the system inadequacies, the system was never set up to reconcile end-of-year balances. And so when the city looks to sweep unspent rollover funds, we really didn't have the system in place to identify exactly by neighborhood council how much their rollover funds were. First ever year-end reconciliation tool has been introduced thanks to Cindy Hench. I don't know if Cindy's here, from Westchester Playa. If we have a moment, I'd love to have her come and talk to you about what she saw and what she was able to do with us. But basically, we've got thousands of dollars of pro bono assistance from a top echelon financial professional who designed basically an easy-to-use Excel-based spreadsheet that accounts for all of the expenses, all of the accounts payable, what the neighborhood councils have on their books, and how that registers with what the city department has using financial management system data. So we rolled that out and expected all neighborhood councils to comply. We sent the tool with instructions. We also, the tool also was accompanied by an audio PowerPoint that we put on our website that walked every neighborhood council treasurer through how to fill out the Excel-based spreadsheet. So it's a very sophisticated tool, but we also wanted to make it as easy to use as possible. To date, we received 30 reconciliation reports from neighborhood councils. We'll be sending out another round, making it mandatory that every neighborhood council fill out the reconciliation worksheet and submit it to us in enough time so that we can get every neighborhood council their remaining balance at the end of the year. That's what we need to be able to, for neighborhood councils to submit budgets for the next fiscal year so that they can take the rollover balance plus the New Year's allocation and form and get a board-approved budget for the next fiscal year. If they don't submit the reconciliations by the extended deadline, then we will freeze funds for neighborhood councils until they comply. Budget submissions for next fiscal year. As you know, the council approved $45,000 for each neighborhood council. We're also constructing a standardized budget template. This is also the first time that the department is doing this. that every neighborhood council will be expected to use the same budget template so that we can monitor, so all the community and public can monitor how neighborhood councils are planning to use the funds and how they actually do spend the funds.
Just again, so that people are listening, hear this clearly. It's not a standardized budget. It's a template for the budget, and the individual neighborhood councils will still be able to determine their own priorities, their own how much to allocate in each particular line item. This is merely an attempt to be able to create a single system of budget accountability and transparency.
That's correct. The ability of neighborhood councils to determine the priorities and how they use the public funds is up to each neighborhood council board. Our department is simply trying to make the system more efficient and transparent for everybody.
I just want to keep reinforcing that because I know that often there's significant amount of resistance whenever you talk about standardization. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for people to understand that the 91 neighborhood councils still will have autonomy over those sorts of decisions. What we're talking about here are efforts to make the administration process more standardized and more efficient and more user-friendly and easier for neighborhood councils as well as easier for the department.
That's correct. I fully support and understand the concerns that some neighborhood councils express in terms of the city mandating how neighborhood councils should spend funds, but that's never been my position. As long as you're following city policies and legal ordinances, neighborhood councils have pretty wide latitude on how their funds are spent. So for next fiscal year, the city council allocated $45,000 as their next year's allocation. We'll be issuing a standardized budget template, which will be requiring due on August 15th. That's later than the beginning of the fiscal year. Largely that's due to the elections that recently took place, that we have to allow neighborhood councils some time to get their board seated, to appoint their officers, their treasurer. So we thought that it would be probably not feasible to expect that neighborhood councils going through leadership changes would expect to comply with the July 1st deadline. As I mentioned earlier on in terms of neighborhood council fiscal capacity, we have to design a system that accommodates for many volunteers, many of whom have limited bookkeeping and financial experience. So neighborhood councils have a lot of responsibilities with using public funds. They have to submit to audits. They have to do reconciliations. They have to submit budgets. They have to maintain financial records. And as I mentioned earlier, our average rate of turnover of neighborhood council treasurers is about 30%. So as I talk to a lot of neighborhood councils, they say the treasurer position is probably the hardest volunteer position to fill because, one, it comes with a lot of responsibility and means a lot of work. And that kind of human resource is not widely available. So I think that's one of the challenges that we face as we administer the funding program for the neighborhood councils. If Cindy, I would like to conclude and then ask Cindy to come and just offer her thoughts in terms of going through and designing the reconciliation tool, some things for you to consider. But it's very important for the City Council to consider that the funding cuts that we sustained, the staffing cuts that we sustained to our funding program is really causing a lot of stress. Our staff are working much longer than they should be. They're working a lot harder, and I don't expect them to be able to continue processing at this rate. We're keeping up, but it's not a sustainable rate of production that we can expect from our staff. So additional funding positions would be critical in the short term. I've requested the mayor's office and to the city council that we try to identify expertise in other city departments that could be on loan to us until this consolidation or standalone decision is made, as we are in this transition period, because we really need some human bodies to help us.
For a more sustainable resolution, though, of this problem, assuming for the moment that Dunn continues to function as a standalone department, how many additional positions would you need in order to appropriately administer the expenditure of $4 million or so in taxpayers' funds, and to ensure that the department can operate most effectively to service the needs of the neighborhood councils while still guaranteeing the integrity of the process, transparency, and accountability for how those funds are being expended?
Correct. So with the way that the funding program is structured currently, with us performing those 5 main functions that I started out in my presentation, we would require 8 full-time staff. We started, before the staffing cutbacks, we had 10 full-time positions devoted to administering the funding program. We went down to 4. I believe it's sustainable. We could responsibly manage the funding program with 8, along with the standardization and efficiencies that I described earlier. Those positions would be mainly accountants and auditors. And then lastly, the city controller's audit of the neighborhood council funding program requested that the city council clarify the city policy on what the neighborhood council funding program should be used for. What's the highest and best value for the use of the public funds? And this is something that I would suggest that you include as part of the public hearing process that your leadership is instituting as we can consider getting feedback from neighborhood councils. But you know, the controller's audit found that short of guns, alcohol, and pornography, neighborhood councils could spend their money pretty much for anything. So I would suggest...
There's some prohibition on those things?
I'm just citing from the audit and some letters. So I would suggest that you put out the question to neighborhood councils to see how can public funds be used to advance the mission of the neighborhood councils, take in what their functions are. So it really is, I think, would provide a lot more clarity for neighborhood councils as well as city leaders about the expectations that we all have for how public funds should be used. And there is wide latitude and understandings about how public funds are to be used by neighborhood councils. So I think some clarity in terms of how those funds would be best used for improving the quality of life. But you know, the 2 main functions of the neighborhood council system are engaging more people in city government and civic engagement, and 2, for city government to be more responsive to local neighborhoods. So if you took those 2 goals that are identified in the charter, how then should public funds be able to be used to further those 2 purposes? And I think we really, as a city family, have not raised that question loud enough to allow substantive input from elected leaders as well as neighborhood councils. But I think that will go a long way to making sure that we're all on the same page for how these public funds should be used.
Okay, very good.
And yes.
I was going to say, before we go to, I have a number of questions, but before we go to those, why don't we ask Ms. Hench to come up, if you don't mind, and talk a bit about the reconciliation process. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
I spent a few hours, I guess, on this reconciliation tool. It's just to somebody who knows how to use Excel, a pretty simple tool, using lots of cool lookup tables and things like that. But basically, it's dependent upon information that's processed by the department. So if we don't have the staff in the department keeping the information up to date, then we don't have a chance of reconciling it regardless of how cool the Excel spreadsheet is. So what I have found through this process was that there was quite a number of demand warrants, check requests that had come in over the years that had been rejected and not paid by the department. Some of these had dates of 2005, 2006, and it was interesting because they were in a drawer waiting for some sort of resolution. But because of the lack of staffing, there has been no follow-up with the neighborhood council to find out if these things should be paid or not. But as BH said, the turnover of treasurers, about 30%. Most of the time, the folks that you're talking to today have no idea what happened in 2005 and 2006. So the lack of staffing causes a lot of problems over there because there's massive amounts of transactions coming from 91 now different requesters that are changing at 30% a year. And so the style in which the information comes in is constantly changing. I think that one of my observations, now, you know, I'm going to say this from having the privilege of working at some world-class organizations in the finance department, that one of the things that Dunn has suffered from is having a bunch of accounting jobs, but no accountants. There are people doing these jobs, but they're not necessarily the people that I would have hired into accounting jobs. There are people who work in the city and end up getting jobs in accounting jobs. And I think that's a tough challenge, to be able to find the people that would do the job the best. You know, they may not be in another city department. So, you know, I think that if this department is able to staff correctly, maybe you can do it with 8 people, as you've suggested. From what I saw, I kind of cringed when I heard 8 because I know that when you had 10, you were behind. So, you know, there needs to be some serious rework on the processes in order to make 8 work. And the challenges of the neighborhood councils I mean, those are going to continue because the people change all the time. So I'm willing to help in any way that I can, and I think that there's some things that we can do. But, you know, one of the big challenges that they have besides people is the system. You know, the system's not made to do, the accounting system isn't made to do what they're doing with it. It's not made to service 91 neighborhood councils. I think it's the same system that's made to service the city of Los Angeles.
Right. And that's what I think we're working on, trying to shape a solution for now. So, and if we can come back to a few of those points. You've mentioned, Mr. Kim, the increase in the purchase card limit to $2,500. You mentioned the elimination of petty cash. So the increase in the purchase cards eliminates some need for the demand warrant process.
Correct.
What's going to fill the gap that is created by removing petty cash? So when you have a situation where somebody needs to spend a relatively small amount of money, it's not something for which a purchase card is appropriate for or available for whatever reason. What's your best suggestion for what system to have in place to allow neighborhood councils to meet those needs? For example, would an individualized checking account be something that would be appropriate? I mean, what are some of the things that you've thought about to take the place of that system?
Well, the controller's audit recommended that the city use an impressed card. And basically that is a system where you establish a maximum allowable balance at any given point, say $200. If a neighborhood council wants to replenish that amount, they have to submit receipts to the city in order to replenish that account. That would be contingent on additional staff if we were to implement that. That's one possibility. Another suggestion that I've tried to push as a way to deal with workload issues as well as the system inconsistencies between what the neighborhood councils need and the city is to allow neighborhood councils to open up their own checking accounts. If you have that major change, there are obviously legal issues involved that we have to consider, and we'd have to get the input of the controller and treasurer because that does represent some increased potential liability for the city. But I feel that if we can, alongside with that, make sure that the auditing and the approvals and the checks and balances are in place, that it may be possible to make that happen. So our department would really play more of an auditing role as opposed to a banking role.
And wouldn't it actually create efficiencies if you have, for example, in a single bank, a single master account, sub-accounts where you have a checking account and a purchase card on the same account, you have, I mean, I can look at my checking account balance on a minute-by-minute basis on the internet. If we had every neighborhood council similarly situated, the audit and accountability responsibility would be pretty simple, I would think. You could look at it at 2 in the morning and know how much the neighborhood council had spent up to that moment and precisely on what. So if we created that kind of a system, it seems to me in some respects, assuming you have dual signatory on checks and those sorts of checks and balance things, that makes it kind of user-friendly because, a local Boy Scout troop has a checking account. I mean, that's a simple thing for anybody to use, and yet at the same time it creates immediate transparency and accountability and a disincentive to abuse, I would think, if you have those things that are sort of, you can check
Right.
on a moment-to-moment basis.
Yes. There are a number of issues that we would have to vet through other city departments, but I think that if we can find the right balance of checks and balances but ease of use, I think the checking account approach would be definitely worth looking into. I imagine we would probably have to still maintain some kind of demand warrant system for large projects, but that for a dollar threshold that exceeds a certain amount that we would go through the city check writing process, but that would still reduce the burden of the department processing demand warrants significantly.
Okay. Thank you. Anything further on this, Mr. Zine?
Well, I made a number of notes regarding some of the issues. What about the equipment, audit of the equipment, laptops, cameras, fax machines, whatever? What's the status of that?
We, about 6 months ago, when Chairman Alarcon was heading this committee, we had initiated a inventory process with all the neighborhood councils. All the neighborhood councils had responded. What we found were, due to some of the turnover issues that was mentioned earlier, that prior boards purchased equipment and either donated it to the city. That's another issue. And
But if they bought it with city money, how would they donate it to the city? The city owned
Belonged
it.
to the city.
yes,
They couldn't donate to something we paid for.
Right. They would purchase some equipment and a laptop computer and donate to their local fire station, for example. So the trackability of those kinds of items gets a little tricky. But
What have we done to correct the equipment purchases? Because I'm sure the city paid for all those items. And do we have a tracking system now whereby whatever item they purchase, other than disposable paper and pens, there's a way to track and do an audit to say, where are these laptops, where are these sound systems? I know some have purchased sound systems for their meetings.
right. We're required to conduct an equipment inventory every 2 years. So we issue tags with instructions and a form where neighborhood councils are to submit all of the listing of all of their equipment. And there are some cases where they say they don't know what happened to the equipment. In which
So what do
case
we do in
let
those
them-
cases? Did we file theft reports or loss reports, or is it just walk away?
Due to the staffing shortages right now, it would, short of going to each neighborhood council and investigating and trying to track down exactly what happened to the equipment, we have to take the neighborhood councils at their word that the equipment is not accounted for.
See, I find that very troubling because we know some neighborhood council members were indicted for stealing, and we become basically an accomplice to that if we don't take action when these other items purchased with tax dollars disappear. Someone's responsible somewhere. And with the turnover, I mean, if we don't keep track of it, with the turnover that we have with neighborhood councils. I went to Tarzana last night. They installed a new board, and the outgoing board hopefully would transfer to the incoming board. And if they don't, let me take this with me, and now they've got property the city paid for that the city should be using that's disappeared. I mean, it troubles me that some people are not as honest as others, and we know that's been proven. Somehow we have to have a tracking system where these items can be tracked, and I don't know if auditing every 2 years works, especially on large items where you're spending hundreds of dollars. So somehow that has to be shored up. I've always had a concern about equipment and what happens to it. I know in law enforcement they check the equipment periodically to make sure that it's there, and if it's not, there's a theft report or a loss report made. You just don't lose equipment like that. So somehow that needs to be resolved with the neighborhood councils on all the equipment that's purchased. Again, other than paper and pens and things such as that.
And further on that, I think we really need to develop some policies on governing equipment purchase, because purchasing a laptop computer for the local fire station that you go to Office Depot to pay for doesn't make sense if the fire department's purchasing process can acquire the same laptop computer at a much more cost-effective rate, for example, or if it's not the kind of laptop computer that the city otherwise utilizes, so you have ongoing maintenance issues and replacement issues and software issues. So I think that to some extent the city needs to have policies in place that direct what the parameters of equipment purchasers ought to be, so that we make sure that, it's a shame for the neighborhood council to spend money that they could otherwise be using on other things, on things that might not be the wisest purchase in the larger scheme of things, but the neighborhood council would have no way of knowing that it could even become a problem for the very city department that they're donating it to.
I think that would be very helpful, because there currently aren't any clear guidelines or policies or procedures governing these kinds of cases where neighborhood councils want to purchase something and donate it to a city department. If there were clear guidelines, then we could make sure that neighborhood councils are aware of that, and we're monitoring the use of public funds in that way.
Because all the money that they receive comes from the public.
Correct.
And all those items are held to the city of Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And whether they want to give it to the fire department or the police department or some other entity, it's too loose. It's got to be tightened up. There's got to be a procedure for that.
Yes.
The other question is money from one year to the other. As explained, there were warrants that were submitted but not paid for a number of years back. Where's that money coming from to pay those warrants if they're going to be paid? Is it coming from the current budget? Or does the budget then roll over from the previous year so you'd have funds for those warrants that have been outstanding for a couple of years?
No, it would be taken from whatever funds are available for the neighborhood councils, which would be current year's allocation. So we didn't, because we didn't have any kind of accounts payable system for tracking it from year to year, if we were to recognize that these outstanding demand warrants did need to be paid, then they would come out of the current year's allocation, which is the value of this reconciliation tool. Is it identifies, it asks the neighborhood council saying, right, these are the list of outstanding demand warrants that we have on our records. Please confirm these, because if you don't confirm them, we're going to pay them, and then we're going to close the books on it. That's the idea.
And then on your review of financials, I was a treasurer when I was with the Police Protective League. And every board meeting, we had board meetings once a week, there'd be a treasurer's report. Do they have a process where they have to give treasurer's reports to the members and to the public when they have a neighborhood council meeting? Is that part of the process?
I've issued a directive to all the neighborhood councils that the boards need to review and approve all purchase card transactions on a monthly basis.
So they'd have at least a monthly review of the budget and where they are and what's been purchased and what's been expended. Okay, and that wasn't in place before,
No.
but it wasn't practiced. Then there's policy versus practice, the policy versus the practice of the neighborhood councils. And obviously, sometimes the policy wasn't followed. Audits, I'm a stickler for audits, so I think that 2 years is too much time to come in with an audit, especially when they have these elections where they have the turnover. Before that board leaves, there should probably be an audit to make sure everything's in place before the new board comes on board. Because the new board comes in, we don't know. While that old board is there, they do know because they're part of that.
Right.
The 13 not complied with the request. What are we doing with those 13 that haven't complied with the request? Just cut off their funding?
We've suspended their funding, and this is for the neighbor councils who haven't closed out their petty cash accounts.
And how much did we have in petty cash accounts? How much were they allocated for petty cash?
Well, the petty cash account was originally set up to not exceed $500
Okay.
any given month, but because, again, the difference between policy and practice, because we weren't monitoring every neighborhood council and their usage of the petty cash, we found some, not the majority, but some neighborhood councils using the petty cash as a third way to pay bills.
Right.
So we received a few closing accounts that contained $1,500 in cash.
And then what about the criteria for a treasurer? Is there an established criteria for a treasurer? How do we establish a criteria for a treasurer? Not that they have to be a CPA, but that they're not a convicted robber or not a convicted burglar, not a convicted car thief. I mean, how do we put something in place, the one who's going to manage the dollars and have access to $45,000 a year? We need to put some criteria for, I know they're elected, et cetera, but that person is the one who's going to be accountable for money. How do we do something to verify that person's able to handle that position, the fiduciary capacity that they assume? And again, no one's forcing them onto the neighborhood council. No one's forcing them to be a treasurer. That's voluntary. And I know they're not compensated, but how do we put some criteria on the treasurer who manages? And we've seen problems, so obviously we want to make sure we don't have those problems again.
Right.
Any suggestions for that?
I think there would be some value to providing some guidelines for kind of bookkeeping or financial experience, maybe minimal levels that people would look for. But, you know, there are many situations where they simply aren't able to choose. I mean, it's literally having 5 people in a room and saying, you know, who wants to do it? But we've compensated for that by focusing on training and education. So, for example, every time a new treasurer is installed by a board, we freeze funds, and then we make sure that that treasurer is trained on the funding program and how it's used. In all of the trainings that we're conducting now for all the newly elected board members, we're training all the board members on the way that the funding program works. So the idea is to make sure that as many people get educated on what the neighborhood council funding program is, what it's to be used for, how it's to be used, and some of the safeguards for making sure that, for example, boards do approve their financials on a monthly basis. So I think that the more we emphasize on the safeguards and the transparency, that it's going to make sure that if a treasurer is falling short, they'll try to find somebody else.
And on the problems that have occurred with the financial, were the treasurers qualified, or was that ever looked into to see if they were qualified to serve in that capacity?
No, the main problem came in that the main problem came from the fact that 1 or 2 people were solely managing the funding program, and the board was not taking its responsibility to approve the funds. So, in those cases of embezzlement, it came to our notice because stakeholders reported that based on the transactions that they saw on our website, they said, you know, these were not transactions that we approved, and they look kind of funny. So that launched the investigation, which resulted in the cases that we took to the LAPD.
And have we completed all those investigations, or are they still underway?
A few are still in process, but a few have been closed, and they've been either sentenced or they're in restitution.
Okay. Restitution out of their pocket, not the taxpayers.
Correct.
Okay. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
And I think that the point of that is that the integrity of the system can't be dependent upon who the individuals are who are given the tasks of handling it. That the integrity of the system has to be based on the processes that are in place, so that so that even if those bad apples should get in there, you have processes in place so that there's checks and balances within each neighborhood council, there's double signatory authority, there's public approval processes and all of that, so that we don't need to be quite so concerned about somebody slipping through who has ill intent, because that ill intent will be revealed and will be seen, and the neighborhood councils will correct for that. So, it sounds like those are the steps that we're starting to take to try to get those processes in place. So, just further along those lines, what outreach have you done to date, if any, and if you haven't, what are the plans for outreach that you have to try to solicit the input from the neighborhood councils themselves about what processes, whether these suggestions that we're talking about will be practical and will be useful, and if not these, what other suggestions there may be among the neighborhood councils for systems to put in place that would create greater utility and transparency and accountability.
Before you speak, I have to go to a high school graduation, so I'll be excused.
Thank you. And congratulations, by the way. You finally got your units? Good.
Thank you, Councilman. I have been convening focus groups of neighborhood council treasurers on a regular basis, and I'm in pretty regular contact with people who are providing me with suggestions and recommendations. That's how we came across Cindy and her ability to develop this great reconciliation tool. But all the major kind of policy and systems changes are posted on our website, and we have feedback that that neighborhood councils can provide us through the blog. That is one way, but I would also suggest that the future of the neighborhood council funding program and the best way to manage it be included as part of the public hearings that you will initiate with the neighborhood council coalitions and the general public, because I think we can get a lot of good suggestions. There are a number of proposals, as you're aware, in terms of alternative ways to manage the funding program. I've also reached out to volunteer associations. Cindy herself has expressed interest in developing a kind of training program for neighborhood council treasurers, where we make the training as accessible as possible, possibly even developing a team of mentors, professional financial experts who'd be willing to provide mentoring to neighborhood councils who are struggling in finding qualified people. And most recently, I became aware of a group, a state society of CPA professionals, who have expressed interest in taking us on as a volunteer project. So I aim to pursue that resource, and we could bring in a number of CPA financial professionals to help on any number of fronts, including assisting neighborhood councils keep their books.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Kim. Appreciate
Thank you, Councilman.
your input. We have 3 cards on this item, and then we have a number of cards for general public comment. So let's start with 2 minutes per speaker on item 1, starting with Jim Mcquisten, followed by Chris Rowe and Barbara Monahan-Burke.
Jim Mcquisten. As you know, I've been following this for a long, long time. As you heard Mr. Kim answer, it was more or less in generalities, not specifics, so we can't really discuss details. But I do want to say this on qualifications of people. When the original ordinance was gotten up, you have to remember that the idea of neighborhood councils was still hostile to the city council. And I personally, as you can see in the record, suggested that if you have boards of neighborhood councils, you must put into the ordinance that certain members of the board must be qualified in certain professions to serve on the boards. And I was concerned about this problem to start with. And the fact that it was not allowed to do that gave me the opinion, and I think it's been borne out, that there are still people who are hostile to the idea of having neighborhood councils and want to make sure that it looks like something to whip. As far as this is concerned, you know I have put in many suggestions on this. I really believe that now the neighborhood council, the amount that's given to them, is a conundrum. But let me say this. I am also the treasurer of a community society. The community society is incorporated. A corporation cannot get a bank account like an ordinary person, and the limits on checking accounts, you have to have maybe $10,000 in the checking account just to maintain the checking account. There are some very, very different requirements for something which is essentially not a personal account. So some of the things that Mr. Kim suggested are just not practical for this. I think a better approach is to say, look, we have a public works department which does put out money for projects. If you have a project that you want to sponsor, put it into the public works department, go through the regular series. We will give you a minimum amount, and then we don't have to worry about these large amounts.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mcquisten. Next speaker is Chris Rowe, followed by Barbara Monahan Burke.
Chris Rowe, West Hills Neighborhood Council, and speaking on behalf of myself. That's okay. They did that at my graduation from CSUN, too.
Half the time I get it right, and half the time I get it wrong, and I never remember which half is right.
That's all right.
Sorry about that.
So, first of all, I do want to thank Mr. Kim. He did send out a blast. We do get blasts from the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment telling us that this program was being generated, the spreadsheet, and he was thankful and appreciative that someone stepped up instead of attacking Dunn or neighborhood department. Somebody wanted to help. So I just want to say that outreach has been done. My concern is that there's an overemphasis that because in the audits that you found a few bad apples, that you're painting us all with the same brush. We did have neighborhood council, but I heard someone earlier today do that. Our neighborhood council has had our elections, and we are writing our bylaws over, and we're making very strong adjustments to bylaws and procedures. And one of the things we did, we have a budget committee, we have a treasurer, and now we have a controller. So we are looking very closely to how money is being expended. The biggest thing in our budget right now is our executive director, the cost of our website, outreach for a newspaper or something to that effect. And if you take that funding away, which I've said before is maybe $20,000 to $25,000 a year, how is our neighborhood council going to function? Because I don't know how we would do it without our executive director. And the thing that a couple big events that are major outreach for us have been the Canoga Park Parade, which we participated in. That was closed down because of fees, and Councilmember Zine was supposed to be involved with that, contributing to that. Our Dad's Day Dash was cut off at the last minute because of funding, because the city wanted to charge extra fees. And I'm concerned that things like the 4th of July event, which Councilmember Zine is putting on, whether we're going to have funding for these things that we do as our big outreach events. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker is Barbara Monahan Burke, followed by Dr. Wiseman.
Good afternoon. I would like to just clarify the title of the Neighborhood Council Budget Advocates. It should keep the mayors in that title. They are chosen as at the Neighborhood Council Budget Day for that limited representation to the mayor to do with the city budget, and yes, it includes the neighborhood council budget. But I don't want that mayor to be lost in there, because I was in the group last year, voted onto it, and this year, some of the group, not Dan, he's always transparent about things, but some of the group seems to have dropped off the mayor's part of this and taken on independently a larger charge, really, than what they were given by the neighborhood councils. So I would just like that to be in the record so that you know it. The budget advocates, neighborhood council advocates are advisory to the mayor for the budget. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker is Dr. Wiseman, followed by Joanne Ivonic-Garb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Parenthetically, there will be a meeting of the Neighborhood Council Budget Advocates right after this meeting at Felipe's. Everyone, including yourself, of course, has already been invited, as you know, and we look forward to continuing the process. For the record, I'm one who would just as soon drop the word mayor off the Neighborhood Council Budget Advocates title, because we're not here to serve the mayor. We're here to serve our communities and our city. More importantly, I'm sorry to have heard what Mr. Zine has said, because as Ms. Rowe has already mentioned, the entire group is being painted with a very black brush that is applied properly just to a very few number of people. And those number of people misfired and misperformed, essentially because we did not have a system that could supervise the funding system. Now, the neighborhood council people, I think, are entirely capable of doing this. Again, in the absence of Mr. Zine, and I'll mention it to him next time I have an opportunity. Many neighborhood councils, and I've been on 3 of them so far, have purchased equipment. In one of my councils, I personally was part of the process to purchase the equipment for a very fine office, a very fine computer, printer, laptop for mobile activity, and installed a system which included a number of platforms, and that included a funding platform. It worked quite well, but with changes in management of that council, which I'm not involved in anymore, that material is now in a storage area. I know where it is, but it's not being used. It's unfortunate. Now, as far as the total funding program is concerned, I'm very pleased to see you're convening a group of people to consider the total future of Dunn, whether the merger or the standalone, that kind of thing. I would very strongly recommend that you convene, again, a treasurer's group to have those people who are interested, knowledgeable, and experienced in managing funds to set up a program for our neighborhood councils. We may need to all have laptops. They can be obtained for free from the LA Shares program. They can be obtained by purchase out of our funds. Many councils have them. And if we're going to use a specific platform, a specific method of doing our funding, we'll all have to have competent equipment and training and applications for it. We can do it. Mm-hmm. I think this is a neighborhood council responsibility that can be done without taking up any more of the resources of a sorely deficient Dunn.
Thank you very much. The final card I have on item number 1 before we go to general public comment is Joanne Ivonic-Garb, but if anybody else would like to speak on this item, please go ahead and fill out a card.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. About 1.5 years ago, I attended an ethics training sponsored by Dunn, and at that point they gave us a very nice brochure with new guidelines for how to get things paid, and what if you had $5,000 or more that it needed a contract, everything. I brought 3 copies of that back to our board, one for myself, one for the treasurer, and one for the budget committee. If it hadn't been for me, the treasurer would not have gotten a copy of this thing for over 6 months. It never really went into place. And that was kind of a problem to me. Now, I'm going to go to some positive things. Cindy Devine, wrote an excellent Excel program. I suggest that every neighborhood council be able to upload directly into that program, if we have it and the Dunn office has it, you should be able to upload right into it, which would eliminate staff needing to input all the information. There is nothing that we should be able to do that shouldn't be able to be uploaded into the current program so that people, the staff doesn't have a hard time or they're overworked. Now, as far as the overworked, I just did a quick little check. There are 91 neighborhood councils. They write an average of 10 checks a month. There are approximately 20 working days in a month, which would mean that they write 45 to 46 checks a day. Divided by 8 staffs, that means that 8 staff members would each be processing 5 to 6 checks a day. That doesn't seem like overwork to me. Okay, the process, I know that our treasurer has complained many times that she sends in the letters, the original letter of request to us, the minutes from our board, and all the paperwork, and they keep coming back and they'll say, what are they going to use this equipment for? You know, well, it's in the letter. Well, we need a specific letter. Well, it's already in the letter, okay? So they keep coming back and asking for more information that they already have. So there has to be some standardization there. And also, I would suggest
You know what? Excuse me, but I'm going to do this. We're going to go to public comment now. You're going to be the first speaker for public comments. You don't
Okay.
need to go. You can just keep going. Can we put another 2 minutes on, please? And then we can just do it that way.
Okay. The neighborhood councils that are functioning very well, they should use us to go to the neighborhood councils that are not functioning well. We should be the models. So if we're doing well, we should be the models, and you know, we would be able to help mentor other neighborhood councils, the new ones, the old ones, the ones that are having trouble. Let's see. I also, you know, there are a lot of retired CPAs around that would love to have a little volunteer gig, and to tap into that resource, you know, and they could be the mentor for each neighborhood council. I'm sure that if you go to the CPA Association in the Valley, you could get retired accountants who would love to help, and any in Los Angeles, any other group. So there are resources, and I think that's about it for right now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so our next speaker in public comment will be Tony Wilkinson, followed by Judy Price. Thank you.
Tony Wilkinson from Panorama City. The mayor really made a brilliant choice a long time ago when he picked Carol Baker Tharp for the head of the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. A woman with some vision who was determined to involve the councils in her decisions and be firm for the decisions when she made them. I know that she was headed toward, shaking up the department, and her loss was a loss to all of us, and particularly, I'm sure, to Mr. Kim, who has, as a loyal soldier, both loyal to his mayor and loyal to his neighborhood councils, tried not to disrupt the operations and has done a good job of staying the course. But in retrospect, hindsight's always great. By not making strong changes, probably it's not been good for any of us, Tony, BH, or the councils of the city. And I think that the solutions that are being proposed to a department that some people are frustrated with, whether you merge them, whether you outsource to non-city employees huge amounts of the core work, I think all of these are more disruptive than any of the changes we could be making in the core department itself. So I'd like to suggest that one of the things we look at are radical changes in how Dunn operates with city employees, and I think that a lot of the things that BH has done already, I can assure you in Panorama City, we're having a meeting tomorrow. We're going to, we really are deeply disturbed by the problems that are brought up by neighborhood purposes grants. The Finance Committee has suggested that we not do any neighborhood purposes grants as opposed to projects in which we're involved that are community outreach types of projects. And we're also going to propose that all the audiovisual equipment be kept in the office with a checkout system. So thank you to BH.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Judy Price, followed by Lisa Sarkin.
Actually, this is sort of backwards. I was hoping to be here to support my friends in Studio City. I'm here to complain about the city clerk conducted elections and the election challenge process, because they have been unfettered in terms of the kind of power that they have, and I wanted to say have been given, but they weren't given. They have taken it. I want to go back and quote from the ordinance that the City Council passed in 2007. It was implemented in 2008. Election challenges shall be resolved by a regional grievance process to be established and set forth in the plan for a citywide system of neighborhood councils. It then lays out several ways to process that. It says, until the establishment of the regional grievance process, the city clerk will be responsible for resolving all neighborhood council election challenges and may issue any related rules and procedures and oppose any remedies to resolve an election challenge. What they've done, though, is quite the opposite. They have written their own rules. In order to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood, this is from the city clerk election division policy number 29. It was effective September 1st, updated May 27th, after the elections were in process. Elections started before that, and they're still going on. In order to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood council election process and ensure that the challenge process is fair, the city clerk office, in its discretion, may issue a new determination and set aside the panel's decision when there are either one, insufficient facts supporting the panel's decision, or two, the uncontroverted facts fail to demonstrate a violation of the spirit and intent of a specific election procedure. That isn't what the ordinance said. The city clerk says they can overturn a panel. They did that. East Hollywood Neighborhood Council election, final challenge results, May 27. Can I just have another minute? I mean, not a minute, 30 seconds.
Yeah. Finish the thought. Even
The
if
city
it's a
clerk
lingering
overturned an election panel. The election panel was made up of 2 neighborhood council stakeholders and 1 city commissioner. In their ruling, they said, under Administrative Code Section 22.816, the city clerk may administer all aspects of the neighborhood council elections. What they're citing is the very ordinance. It doesn't say that in there, including issuing directives and policies to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood council election process. Therefore, the city clerk's recommendation will stand. In other words, they overturned the panel. There are some and this leads into Studio City's thing, because they have been, I think, done a terrible disservice in terms of their grievances, which the city clerk has shelved.
So let me do this, and let's go with Lisa, and then after we're done with that, maybe we can discuss it offline a little bit and try and drill down a little bit deeper. Ms. Sark.
Do you mind if Barbara goes after me? Because that's the 3. We didn't want to.
We wanted Barbara.
We knew
first.
we needed 2 minutes for each one of these.
No problem. Yeah,
Thank you so much.
She was almost next anyway.
Okay.
So
Lisa Sarkin, I'm not here for our neighborhood council. We haven't been able to vote on this yet. But I wanted to put into the record an issue that happened during our elections. We have a large contingency of realtors that are licensees and that are not brokers. The state's requirement for licensees is that they are employed by a broker. Although we believe that many of the real estate agents or salespeople, however you want to call them, voted and claimed that they were business owners. 2 prominent brokers, one of which won a seat on our board, stated that all the licensees are independent contractors and have a professional license. But that doesn't mean they're allowed to have a business license, and so they are really an employee of the broker who has the business license in Studio City. So at the beginning of our discussions about this just before the election, Stella Yoon of the city clerk's office was contacted by Ron Taylor, and he was told that real estate salespersons are not business owners, that they don't have business licenses, and that they are employees. At the election site ourselves, myself and Barbara and Ron and several other people spoke to some of the agents we knew that were coming in, and they said they were business owners. So we discussed it with Stella even there, and we were told that the city clerk's office considers real estate salespeople as employees. So there was a challenge made, and then I'm going to let Barbara speak about the rest of it because she'll go into that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to be pretty specific about it. I was in the category, business owner category, and the challenge I made was to the status of all business owners, not just the real estate agents, so it would cover everybody, who had voted. And it was brought up, as Lisa said, particularly because so many real estate agents had just mentioned outside that they had voted as business owners. And the California law, when you read it, shows that they are employed. They're not business owners. They have a business license from the state, but it's not business owners. Anyways, I just wanted to let you know that the challenge was blocked. Not even did they get to the challenge. Easy, I spoke to him because Stella wasn't available, but basically they never let the challenge even be thought to be a challenge because we did self-affirmation. In the past, neighborhood councils have always been allowed. We have challenged with self-affirmation. I actually wanted documentation, as did a minority of our board, just I think by one person. So self-affirmation went through this time. But we've always been able to challenge. And then sometime after we had to make that last year to do with the determination for self-affirmation instead of documentation, the city clerk put on some site or something that self-affirmation would not be able to be appealed, challenged. Easy says that's the way it is in the city, but I said that has never been what happened in neighborhood council elections because we could always challenge. So we've got a problem here that they did not. I went to many of the election meetings on Saturday mornings and was never told this there. Our bylaws committee, and I'm on that committee, but the chair was never told it. Our president and vice president, nobody was ever told that this was going to be a change, and it was done after we all had to make this choice. I made this challenge because the system is wrong here, and it doesn't just affect Studio City or this category. We weren't allowed to challenge in another category for the same thing that a challenge was put forth. So I don't think it's right of the city clerk to change the rules after we've all had to decide how we're going to go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That brings up our next speaker, will be Jim Mcquisten, followed by Dr. Wiseman.
Jim Mcquisten, I'll make this short. Time's running out. We only had about 3 months to get this squared away. It took about 2 years, in my recollection, to get the first ordinance out. It's really something we have to get moving on. I have offered to do something on that, and as you know, I have put in things, but I haven't been into any of the meetings. Of course, I'm working on the city's budget right now pretty hard.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Wiseman, followed by Mary Garcia.
Thank you, sir. I've just handed to you the latest of the cash flow diagrams. I think most everyone in this room has seen them at one time or another. There's a huge amount of information there, but it's very nice to be able to look at cash flow, which is the real cash distributions of the city, and know where we're standing and how we got here. Now, the thing that's concerned me the most for a long period of time, and I hope you or one of your council member colleagues will take up an issue, to do what we can to stop this big blue line from just going down and down and down. The first 6 months of the year, we are in deficit spending every month, were it not for a loan called a TRAN that we take in July. There are several mechanisms by which we can reverse this. But as you look at this document, and I'm just going to hold it up so the people in back of me can see, the big green upright incomes are all in December through June. That process really stymies the city and causes us a great deal more expense than we have to have. The TRAN, which is the backside of that, and I'm going to again hold that up, started as a $15 million short-term loan in 1997. It is now $1.2 billion with a 16% with a $16 million interest rate. Now that's remarkable.
I only have the first page.
I'm sorry, sir. I'll be glad to give you a two-sided copy. There we go. And $16 million for $1 million loan, which really lasts about 9 to 11 months, is really a very nominal rate, but it's obtained at the expense of the retirement plans. Our two retirement plans pay 8% for an early loan that we pay to them as soon as we get this money. Now, they're not making 8%, and so that's going to diminish their funds. It may diminish the city's total amount of interest, but I don't think it's fair to do it on the backs of our retirees or our potential retirees, and I think some real serious look needs to be taken and some real serious prompt action needs to be taken to diminish that blue line that seems to want to go down to the bottom of the sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mary Garcia, followed by Chris Rowe.
Good afternoon. A couple of things. First, I want to say something about the transfer of property. I think that one of the reasons that it gets lost or misused or disappears is because it transitions with every incoming board. And I remember early on, because I've been there since the beginning with our neighborhood council, that it was suggested that we used a storage facility. And I wanted to bring that up as a recommendation across the board, because you have one key, a storage facility year after year, and you know where everything is. Now, otherwise you have things that are with this person, and the next person gets it, whatever's left over, and it's really pretty tattered by that time. So that's just one suggestion. The other concern, or this is really not another concern, but a really big concern to me. I sat for 5 weekends, as did Mr. Martinez, at bylaws task force meetings. And we worked very hard, 4 and 5 hours a whack for us, and we took it very seriously. And one of the main concerns with this for me was a mandate regarding the Code of Ethics workshop. It's a very serious thing to me that we should all be playing by the same rules and honesty, and that we know that the community is above every concern, that, it just surpasses everything. So it's my understanding now, and I haven't been to several bonk meetings, there are a couple of people that are totally against mandating Code of Ethics. And for me, it's unbelievable that somebody can even think this way, when you're dealing with money and community. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, and I feel that, and I spoke with Mr. Martinez earlier, suggesting that we have these workshops, because I've taken them several times, and every time I take one of the workshops, I learn something different, something new, or perhaps I hear the same thing twice, and it just becomes very refreshing and new to me that I can apply. So I would suggest that we start doing those if we can. And I know that budget is critical now, but I think that this is something we really need to look into and support.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Chris Rowe, followed by, as of now, my last card is Cindy Hedge.
Hi, Chris Rowe. First, I want to support Mr. Kim and say what we need in this city more than anything is accountants and auditors. I mean, that's integral to everything that's going on. For their staffing, 100%. The second thing, there are a lot of meetings that occur, whether they're training that they're putting on, DWP meetings, and they put them on at like 8 o'clock on Saturday morning. Well, for people like me that live at the far end of West San Fernando Valley, that means getting up at 6. And that's hard because sometimes we're at neighborhood council meetings and things till 10 o'clock at night. So for us to have to be up at Saturday at 6, I would like to just say we need more meetings at night or late afternoon, and I appreciate this time of day so much. You just don't know. Third thing, as neighborhood council members, we spend our own money, whether it's printing out something for you, driving down here, or our meals or whatever. It's our own money. But one thing I really object to that I wish you could address is we have to pay to park at the DWP. And the last time I was there, Jack Humphreyville said it was $21. I want you to know that I have walked there 2 weeks in a row. I parked downstairs. Thank you for letting me park here for free. Someone mentioned the ethics and conflict of interest. I've contacted Mr. Martinez about this. I've taken the training with him. I've looked at it online. People say we're self-policing, and I'll say to members of my neighborhood council, I think you need to contact, because that's exactly what it says in our training, that if you believe you've taken the training, if you believe you have a conflict of interest, contact the city attorney. And I will tell people, I think maybe because you're a realtor or whatever it is, you should really be contacting the city attorney, and they don't do it. And then we're not allowed to report people because we think they have an ethics violation. So that's a concern to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our final speaker, Cindy Hedge.
Thank you. When these ladies were talking about the city clerk, it reminded me of something I wanted to mention to you. When we were seating our board, we came into a little bit of a conflict between what the city clerk had told us in terms of when the board was to be seated versus our bylaws. And so after some research, we concluded that the city clerk kind of overstepped what appeared to be overstepped their authority in telling us what to do after the election. Because from the ordinance that I read, they had the authority to perform the election, but not to tell us what to do afterwards. So I wanted to mention that to you because it was kind of an aha for me. And I'm sure that nobody did that intentionally. They were just trying to do their job. But, you know, when we're trying to follow the rules and there's actually ordinances out there and city charters, and they need to be followed. And I think that it would be an understandable mistake for somebody who's just trying to get the job done to overstep it, because maybe they're not used to working in those bounds. But I felt like I was kind of hanging out on the edge of a cliff there for a few days when I said, City Clerk, we're not going to pay attention to that memo. And I heard silence. So we're seated, we're fine, we're still alive, but I think that when we do these city clerk elections again in the future, that we should be a little bit more cognizant of what they really have the authority to do.
Well, and we will be conducting a comprehensive review of the election process of this year and the clerk's role in that process and what policy changes need to be made to the election process at the conclusion of this cycle, FYI. So that's already on the drawing board.
Good.
Thank you very much. If there's nothing else, that brings us to our conclusion. We're not taking any action, so we can adjourn. Thank you all very much.